The Secret Drawer, written and read by Christopher Halton. In early 1925, I was fortunate enough to take up residence in my late aunt's generous apartment situated in one of Belgravia's mews. These buildings were, by way of explanation, former stables that had once served the grand houses fronting the main streets. With the rise of the motor car, many had since been converted into highly desirable homes, discreetly tucked into narrow cobbled lanes that offered a degree of seclusion unheard of amid the clamour of modern London. Astoria Cottage was a two-storey house comprising 3 bedrooms, along with quarters for a live-in maid. It included a comfortable lounge, a dining room and a kitchen, and proved well suited to my needs. Unfortunately, the house was entirely unfurnished, the contents having been inherited and swiftly removed by a cousin. Armed with a modest selection of furniture from my former one-bedroom flat and a healthy cash allowance, I spent my weekends combing the city's antique shops in search of appropriate pieces. In most respects, my efforts were successful. However, I found it unexpectedly difficult to locate a proper 18th century writing desk in the Sheraton style, complete with multiple pocket drawers and slender tapered legs. After leaving my card with several dealers, I was pleasantly surprised to receive a telephone call from one of them, a man based in Whitechapel, who claimed to have a promising lead. In exchange for an agreed finder's fee to be paid later, he directed me to a little-known side street in the area, scarcely more than a narrow passageway. There I came upon a small bow-fronted antique shop of considerable age, run by a Mr. Samuels. The proprietor, a genial man well into his later years, led me to the rear of the shop, where I immediately saw precisely what I had been seeking. He assured me it was a genuine Sheraton, no doubt a calculated embellishment, but after some spirited negotiation we settled on a price acceptable to us both. The desk was delivered a few days later. It was a handsome late 18th century piece, highly practical for storing documents and various personal effects, all of which could be secured under lock if necessary. It was unquestionably well made, though equally clearly an imitation, almost certainly constructed using designs published in the cabinet maker's and upholsterer's drawing book. I placed it in the lounge by the window, where I could work by daylight. I was very pleased, or so I believed. A few weeks later, the Mews house was finally arranged to my satisfaction. The rooms were carefully furnished, the walls freshly painted, the whole set out with what I considered a deliberate and settled order. And yet something was shifting. I could not have said how or precisely what. The change was not tied to any particular room or object, but to the house as a whole. An unease had begun to seep into my days, subtle but persistent, like a draught whose source could not be traced. I found the feeling unsettling, but attributed it to recent upheavals in my life, and with a conscious effort chose to dismiss it. That complacency did not survive the afternoon in question. Returning home earlier than usual, I entered the study and immediately saw that every pocket drawer in the writing desk had been pulled fully open. Their contents lay scattered across the floor as though shaken loose rather than methodically emptied. Papers were strewn face down and overlapping, envelopes torn, and small personal items flung aside in a manner that suggested haste rather than theft. I called for my maid, Lizzie. She appeared at once, and on seeing the scene, let out a sharp, stifled cry, quickly suppressing it as though she feared the sound itself. "Oh, my God, sir," she said, pale and visibly shaken. "I was here not more than 20 minutes ago before you returned, and everything was as it should be. I put fresh flowers from the market in a vase by the other window. You can see them there. Nothing was disturbed. I hope you don't think it was me." Her voice faltered and she began to sob quietly, not hysterically, but with a restrained and genuine fear of a consequence. I took her by the shoulders and held her until she steadied. "I think we have had a visitor, Lizzie," I said, though even as I spoke the words felt imprecise. "Please call the police." They arrived promptly, a sergeant and a constable, both thorough and methodical. The house was searched from top to bottom. Nothing was discovered. There were no signs of forced entry, no damaged locks, and no open windows. The neighbours, attentive to any unfamiliar presence in the mews, reported nothing out of the ordinary. The sergeant, an experienced man of many years' service, suggested practical precautions, installing an alarm system linked to the police and fitting locks to the lower sash windows to prevent them from being raised. I undertook these measures without delay. Yet none of this addressed the more troubling point. No other room had been entered. Nothing of value was missing. Not a single drawer elsewhere in the house had been disturbed. It was as though whoever or whatever had come had known exactly where to look, and, more unsettling still, had found nothing worth taking. For several weeks thereafter, the measures appeared effective. There were no further disturbances, and the incident gradually receded from my thoughts, if never entirely from my mind. It was therefore with some surprise that I received an unexpected visitor one evening. He introduced himself as Mr. Carver and said he wished to speak with me about the writing desk. He was a short, solidly built man of middle years, with a thick dark moustache and thinning hair to match. He wore a bowler hat and a dark two-piece suit of unremarkable cut, and I took him immediately for a solicitor's clerk, or something akin to that profession. Cautiously, and without inviting him fully inside, I spoke with him on the threshold, intrigued despite myself by the purpose of his visit. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said in a carefully measured voice, "but I have called at the bequest of a client who attended my offices earlier today in connection with the Sheraton desk. I have been instructed to offer you twice the sum you paid to the antiques dealer, on the condition that my client's identity remain anonymous, and that the item be removed within the week to allow you to make other arrangements for the purpose for which you acquired it." I was, I confess, visibly taken aback. "Someone rifled the drawers of that desk some weeks ago," I said, "apparently in search of something. Your appearance here this evening suggests that your client may have been responsible." He replied at once, clearly intending to reassure me, insisting this was not the case, and that he was acting entirely in good faith. The furniture itself, he said, however implausible it might sound, was a problem in its own right. Nothing about the exchange made sense to me. I suggested that his client attend in person so that we might discuss matters properly and clear up these misunderstandings. At this, Mr. Carver's expression changed. The affability drained away, replaced by something markedly more guarded. "No, sir," he said quietly. "You wouldn't want him to come and see you. You definitely would not." I took this perhaps unfairly as a veiled threat, though his tone remained polite. Maintaining my composure, I asked whether he had a business card so that I might consider his proposal before contacting him again. "Oh, certainly, sir," he replied, producing one at once. "Here is my card and my telephone number. It would be best to call by telephone in the first instance. My employer would like this matter dealt with discreetly, if you understand." He smiled then, not warmly, but with the polite finality of a concluded transaction, and took his leave. I closed the door and stood for several moments in the hall, the card still in my hand, acutely aware of how quiet the house had become. That evening, while sitting alone in the lounge and listening to music from the gramophone, I experienced something more unsettling than anything that had come before. At first I sensed it rather than heard it, a faint, uneven tremor like the distant passage of a heavy vehicle. It took several moments to realize the sensation was local. The writing desk had begun to vibrate. The movement was initially so slight that I doubted myself, but it soon became unmistakable. The vibration deepened and steadied until the papers I had left upon its surface began to creep, then slide, finally dropping one by one onto the floor. The faint scratch of the gramophone needle at the end of the record suddenly seemed intrusive, almost impertinent. It was as though something unseen had grown impatient. The desk rocked at first subtly, then with increasing insistence, as if urged by hands that could not be seen but were determined to be felt. The motion carried with it a sense of urgency that was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. I rose from my chair, shaken less by the movement itself than by the intention behind it, and before I was fully aware of what I was doing, I cried out angrily, "Stop it! In the name of my dear Saviour, stop it!" The effect was immediate. The desk fell still at once, as though it had never moved at all. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the gramophone had run down. It was then that I resolved, finally and without reservation, to uncover the truth of the matter. That same evening I telephoned a friend, Alex French, a valuer with a major auction house and a man of long experience in antique furniture. I confined my account to the desk itself and its provenance, omitting any mention of disturbances, and he agreed to call the following morning as he already had business in the vicinity. He arrived shortly after 11. Alex was tall and gaunt, casually dressed in a tweed jacket and grey flannels, with the air of someone more accustomed to examining objects than people. After greeting me, he went straight to the writing desk and stood before it for several minutes in silence, studying it with an intensity that bordered on reverence. At length he asked whether he might examine it more closely. He began with the back and underside, grunting softly from time to time, then removed each drawer in turn to inspect the joints and runners. His manner was methodical, assured, and entirely untroubled. "Now," he said at last, "if I am right, I should be able to show you something interesting." He slipped his hand into the empty pocket of one of the drawers, feeling along the interior with deliberate care. After a moment he smiled. "Ah," he said quietly, "here you are." There was a distinct click. What I had always taken for decorative veneer along the side of the cabinet shifted almost imperceptibly, and a shallow concealed drawer slid out, so perfectly disguised that its existence had gone entirely unnoticed. Inside it, barely fitting, lay an ancient-looking envelope sealed with dark red wax. Alex drew it out carefully. The instant he did so, he was thrown backward, as though struck by an unseen force. He hit the floor with such power that I feared he might have been seriously injured. The envelope slipped from his grasp and fell between us, and the writing desk, mercifully, did not move at all. For several seconds he remained where he had fallen, clearly stunned. Then, to my great relief, he rose slowly to his feet. "I cannot reason nor properly understand what has just occurred," he said at last. "Whether I slipped or lost my footing in some way, I honestly cannot say. But I assure you, I am quite unhurt." He paused, collected himself, and gestured toward the desk. "The piece is very much in the manner of Sheraton," he continued, his professional focus returning, "and of exceptionally high quality. As you observed, it contains a concealed drawer released by a hidden catch. Such features were uncommon, though not unheard of. More often found in Davenport desks or campaign furniture, intended to hide valuables or sensitive papers. In this case, however, the drawer appears to have been made specifically to hold an envelope." He regarded the desk again more cautiously. "I would date it to around 1795. You have, without question, acquired something quite remarkable. Should you ever consider selling it, I would strongly advise contacting me at the auction house." I thanked him, though my attention had already returned to the object on the floor. "Let us see what this envelope is all about," I said. "It must be jolly important." He stooped, hesitated briefly, then picked it up and passed it carefully to me. The wax seal was bound with fine string and bore an unfamiliar armorial device. On the face of the envelope, written in a precise Latinized copperplate hand, were the words servandum usque ad diem, to be kept until the day. For reasons I could not then have explained, I felt reluctant to break the seal. It was clear that this curious desk possessed a history far older and more deliberate than I had first imagined, one rooted in concealment rather than mere ownership. After steadying his nerves with a glass of port, Alex departed, apparently none the worse for his ordeal, though I noticed he did not so much as glance at the desk as he left. That evening, once the house had settled into its familiar quiet, I removed the envelope from the desk and by lamplight carefully sketched the impression of the seal. I then spent the better part of an hour consulting a volume of Burke's Peerage, comparing heraldic devices and marginal notes with growing unease. From this I deduced that the arms belonged to an extinct branch of a French Huguenot family, refugees who had arrived in England shortly after 1685, following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, when Louis XIV outlawed the Protestant faith. The family name was de Vauclair. According to Burke's, Jean-Baptiste de Vauclair, styled Comte de Vauclair in France, married Charlotte Ashcombe, daughter of Lord Ashcombe, thereby bringing the family, at least nominally, into the English nobility. A baronial dignity was said to have been recognised thereafter, though the wording was curiously vague. What struck me most was the abrupt termination of the line. Jean-Baptiste and his wife were recorded as having died in a fire in 1720 without surviving issue, and the title was listed as extinct. No account of the fire was given, no mention of effects recovered, no reference to papers, correspondence, or estates. It was then that I realized something essential was missing, not merely from the book, but from the story it refused to tell. Still, I did not break the seal for fear of what it might contain. To complete this historical puzzle, I could not understand how a piece of furniture containing something of such evident importance had come into my possession through a small antiques dealer in the East End of London, an area not noted for fine quality pieces, nor why it was evidently valuable enough for someone to offer well over its market worth to reclaim it. And so I resolved to pay Mr. Samuels another visit, to discover how he had come by it in the first place. I arrived at the location the following day, and I say location advisedly, for the business was now an empty, dusty shop, with a warm for sale sign hanging by a cord inside the window. I made inquiries in the locality and learned to my shock that Mr. Samuels had passed away some weeks previously. Despite my disbelief, this was confirmed by the estate agency handling the sale of the premises, which included a small lodging above the shop. They provided me with the contact number for the solicitors acting on behalf of the estate, and I was further shaken to discover that it was the same number Mr. Carver had given me. I also consulted the local newspaper serving the district, which corroborated the account and added that Mr. Samuels was believed to have died of a heart attack and had no known next of kin. I returned home and at last resolved to open the letter. I admit that my hand trembled as I took up a paper knife, but I could not continue in ignorance. As the blade slit the envelope, a sharp sulphurous odour filled the lounge, and the writing desk began to shake once more with unmistakable agitation. The document within proved to be a contract written on parchment and signed by Jean-Baptiste de Vauclair, and what appeared to be the name Samael. The florid script was rendered in a Latinized hand, and with my limited understanding of that dead language, I soon grasped its nature, a Faustian bargain executed in blood. The document bore the title Instrumentum Vitae Perpetuae Inter Jean-Baptiste de Vauclair et Diabolum, an instrument of perpetual life between Jean-Baptiste de Vauclair and the devil. And as I recalled, Samael was, in Judaic tradition, a fallen angel. All of these questions, however, were soon to be answered. Quite unexpectedly and without warning, I received another visit from Mr. Carver, He arrived at my door in a state of visible agitation and demanded admittance, insisting that he must explain his interest in the writing desk at once. He added in a low and urgent voice that I was in the gravest danger if I refused him. Frankly, I was by then at my wits' end. The situation had long since passed beyond the bounds of reason, and I desired nothing so much as some form of resolution. Given all that had already occurred, I allowed him inside. He appeared profoundly distressed. His face was slick with perspiration, and his eyes darted nervously about the room, as though he feared he was not alone. "I know you have found it," he said at once, "and that you have opened it. I felt it when you broke the seal. Without the document, I am exposed." I held up the parchment before him and told him that I was prepared to surrender it, provided he explained what was truly going on. Before he could answer, a deep voice spoke from across the room. "I will tell you." Standing there, as solid and unmistakable as any living man, was the late Mr. Samuels, the antiques dealer. He pointed a long finger at Mr. Carver. "There stands Jean-Baptiste de Vauclair," he said calmly, "a man who sold me his soul. The terms were simple. In return for eternal life, he was required to provide me with a human soul every 50 years. Mr. Carver cried out, but Samuels continued unmoved. "He gave me his wife. He gave me the souls of 3 others. Then he ceased to pay. For that failure, I took the desk, and I allowed it to pass into your possessions as punishment. It is no more complicated than that." He turned his gaze upon me, and I felt it settle like a physical weight. "The debt remains outstanding," he said, "and now I will accept payment either from him or from you." De Vauclair fell to his knees and begged me to hand over the document, promising anything if only I would do so. But I wanted neither mercy nor bargains. I wanted them both gone. Without another word, I tore the parchment in 2. The fragments flared at once, igniting like a struck match, and vanished utterly before they could touch the floor. A terrible cry filled the room. Both figures began to lose substance, their outlines wavering and dissolving as though consumed by an unseen fire. De Vauclair screamed in agony as his form collapsed inward upon itself, fading rapidly into nothingness. Samuels lingered a moment longer, his expression unreadable before he too was gone. The room fell silent. The writing desk stood motionless by the window, and I was alone. Suffice to say, I took Alex French's advice, and the desk was later sold at auction. The end.